What would you do if your own son was ashamed of who you are? If he introduced you not as the woman who raised him, sacrificed for him, and built everything from nothing, but as someone simple? That's exactly what happened to me. For years, my son thought I was just another middle-aged office worker, quiet, ordinary, forgettable. He never knew I made $40,000 a month. He never knew I was a senior executive who commanded boardrooms and signed million-dollar deals. And when the day came to meet his wife's wealthy, pretentious parents, I decided to test something. I dressed in my oldest clothes, carried my torn canvas bag, and walked into that fancy restaurant pretending to be poor, just to see how they'd treat me. What happened that night shattered every illusion, exposed every mask, and left everyone, including my son, speechless, because the truth? Power doesn't always wear pearls or diamonds. Sometimes it wears silence. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button if you believe respect should never depend on wealth. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the power of honesty, humility, and inner strength. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Alright, let's begin this unforgettable story. For as long as my son could remember, I lived what most would call an ordinary life. I woke up early, took the same route to work every day, came home tired, cooked with whatever was left in the fridge, and fell asleep on the couch watching the evening news. To Marcus, I was just his mother, steady, predictable, unremarkable. He never questioned how bills were always paid on time or why the fridge was never empty. He simply assumed I was another overworked woman making ends meet, and I never corrected him. Maybe I should have. But something inside me told me it was better this way. You see, I wasn't a struggling office clerk. I wasn't scraping by. For nearly 2 decades, I've been a senior executive at a multinational company, the kind of job that people spend their whole lives chasing. My decisions affected thousands. My signature carried weight, and my monthly salary was $40,000. But I never spoke of it, not once. To Marcus, I was just mom, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I grew up in a world that taught me that dignity doesn't need decoration. I watched people chase prestige, boasting about promotions and possessions, while the real wealth, peace of mind, integrity, respect, slipped quietly through their fingers. I promised myself I'd never live that way. I didn't need the world to applaud me. I just needed to live with grace and purpose. So I lived simply. My apartment was small but warm. The furniture was old but solid. The walls carried more memories than art. The handbag I carried every day was 10 years old and soft from use, and the car I drove was modest but reliable. I dressed plainly, spoke softly, and never drew attention to myself. You'd pass me on the street and never guess that I signed contracts worth millions, and that's exactly how I liked it. Because true power, I learned, doesn't shout, it observes. It listens. It waits. My colleagues called me the quiet storm. I was never the loudest voice in the boardroom, but I was the one they listened to when it mattered. Behind every calm nod was a calculation, a plan, a quiet certainty that I didn't need validation from anyone. But outside that world, in the space I called home, I was just a mother, a single mother. A woman who had built a life from ashes and refused to crumble, no matter how heavy the load got. Marcus never knew the nights I worked late while he slept at a neighbor's place. He never saw the countless mornings I left before sunrise, clutching coffee in one hand and hope in the other. He never saw me cry in the office restroom after losing a deal, or how I'd wipe my face, square my shoulders, and walk back out as if nothing had happened. He just saw dinner on the table and a mother who never seemed to complain. Maybe that's why he thought life was easy for me. Maybe that's why he thought I was simple. I can't blame him. I made sure he never saw the cracks. I wanted him to grow up believing in effort, not privilege. I wanted him to value work, not wealth. To chase meaning, not money. So I stayed quiet about mine. Some might call it humility. Others might call it deception. But to me, it was love. Money, I'd learned, is a strange thing. It reveals more about people than it ever hides. Those who have little often cling to it. Those who have plenty either flaunt it or forget it. I preferred to forget. My wealth was not in my bank account. It was in the choices I could make freely. The freedom to walk away from anything that compromised my peace. The freedom to say no without fear. The freedom to be underestimated, because being underestimated is a kind of armor, and I wore that armor well. On the outside, I was mild, almost invisible, but inside I carried a quiet fire. Every decision, every investment, every step was deliberate. My modest apartment wasn't a limitation, it was a strategy. The fewer eyes on my wealth, the freer I was. But beneath all that, there was one thing I never quite mastered, the distance between who I was and who my son thought I was. Marcus had grown into a fine man, kind, hardworking, and ambitious in his own way. But there were moments when I sensed something subtle in him, a hesitation when his friends asked about me, a quick change of subject when conversations turned to family. At first, I thought I imagined it. Then I realized he wasn't embarrassed by me. He was embarrassed for me. He believed I hadn't made it. He believed I had lived small, and though I never let it show, that knowledge stung deeper than I could admit. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was happy, that he had found love, that he was building a life of his own. Simone, his wife, was a bright woman. Polished, well-educated, raised in a wealthy family that never had to worry about next month's bills. She carried herself with grace, though sometimes a little too much of it, the kind that borders on superiority. But I welcomed her into my home, into our family, with open arms. Because that's what mothers do. At least, that's what I believed then. For a while, everything seemed fine. Marcus visited less often, but I told myself that was normal. He was married now, building a new life. When he did visit, he was affectionate but distracted, as if his thoughts were somewhere else. I noticed Simone rarely joined him. There was always a reason, work, a cold, a prior engagement. I didn't push. I never do. Until one Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. His voice was cheerful but tight, the kind of cheerfulness people wear when they're hiding nerves. "Mom," he said, "I need to ask you for a favor." I smiled instinctively. "Of course, son. Anything." Simone's parents are visiting from overseas. It's their first time here. They want to meet you. There was a small pause, just long enough for my instincts to stir. Then he added, "We're having dinner on Saturday at a restaurant downtown. Please come." Something in the way he said please didn't sound like an invitation. It sounded like a warning. I leaned back on the sofa, the phone warm against my ear. "Do they know anything about me?" Silence. Then, softly, "I told them you work in an office, that you live alone, that you're simple, that you don't have much." Simple. That word again. Small, harmless, but heavy enough to crush pride if you let it. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment, my mind turning slowly. So that was how he wanted them to see me, as the modest mother, the humble worker, the woman who'd done her best with limited means. It hurt, but not in the way you might think. It wasn't vanity, it wasn't pride, it was disappointment. Not in him, in the distance that had grown between us, in the illusion he had built around me. But after a moment, I smiled faintly. "All right, Marcus. I'll be there." When we hung up, I looked around my apartment. The same walls, the same old furniture, the same quiet orderliness of a life lived deliberately. And a thought came to me, sharp and cold. If they expect a poor woman, let them meet one, because sometimes the only way to see the truth in others is to become their mirror. That night, I opened my old wardrobe and ran my fingers over the rows of neatly pressed blouses, the tailored suits I wore to board meetings, the elegant silk scarves I saved for conferences. Then my hand paused on something at the back, a plain, gray dress. Faded, wrinkled, shapeless. Perfect. I laid it on the bed and stared at it for a long time, I wasn't angry. Not yet, I was curious. Curious about how these people, Simone's polished, affluent parents, would treat someone they believed had nothing to offer. Would they still smile as wide? Would they still speak with warmth? Or would they shrink me down to the size of my outfit? Deep down, I already knew the answer. People reveal who they are not when they meet equals, but when they meet someone they think is beneath them. I would find out soon enough. But that night, as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, something stirred inside me, not bitterness, not fear, but a quiet resolve. Let them underestimate me. Let them whisper, let them pity, let them sneer. They wouldn't know that the woman they dismissed as poor could buy the restaurant they were dining in. They wouldn't know that the naive mother they judged had built an empire in silence. And when the time came, they would learn the truth, not through boasting, not through revenge, but through the quiet, devastating clarity of reality. I closed my eyes and smiled in the dark, because the stage was set, and they had no idea what kind of story they had just walked into. The rest of that week passed in a strange haze. I went to work as usual, morning meetings, conference calls, signatures on contracts worth more than the apartment I lived in, but my mind wasn't really there. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be Marcus calling again, this time to change his mind, to say the dinner was cancelled. But he didn't. Each passing day made it more real. Saturday was coming, and so was the moment of truth. At night, I found myself replaying our conversation over and over. Not the words, the tone. That subtle strain in his voice, the way his pleas sounded like a plea not to embarrass him. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a request for me to be smaller, quieter, more manageable. And that, more than anything, broke my heart. I had raised my son to be kind, independent, and proud of his roots. But somewhere along the way, the world had taught him that appearances mattered more than character. That simplicity was something to hide, not honor. That a mother's humility was something to be apologized for. Maybe Simone's family had something to do with that. Maybe not. Either way, I needed to see for myself. Friday evening, after a long day of meetings, I sat by my kitchen window with a cup of tea and watched the city lights flicker on. It was a view I'd seen for 20 years, the same skyline, the same slow hum of traffic, the same feeling of peace I'd always found in solitude. But that night, it felt different, heavier, as if something unseen was shifting beneath the calm surface of my life. I reached for my phone and scrolled through old photos of Marcus, his graduation, his first job, the day he got engaged. In every picture, his smile was genuine, his eyes bright. But in the last few, the wedding photos, something was different. The smile was still there, but it looked practiced, almost cautious. Simone, on the other hand, looked flawless, every hair in place, every pose carefully curated. They looked like a couple from a magazine, and yet something about the image felt hollow. I wondered if love could survive in a world that valued perfection over authenticity. Saturday came faster than I expected. I woke up early the same way I did every day, but there was no rush to go anywhere. My morning routine felt oddly ceremonial, the slow brewing of coffee, the careful folding of laundry, the soft hum of a jazz record playing in the background. The world outside was already awake, full of noise and motion, but inside my apartment, time stood still. On the table lay the gray dress, wrinkled, dull, and perfectly unremarkable. I had taken it out the night before and left it there, almost like a dare to myself. I looked at it now, studying the frayed seams, the faded fabric, the way it seemed to sag even without being worn. It was a costume, and tonight I would wear it like armor. I slipped it on slowly, button by button. It hung loose on my body, swallowing the shape of who I really was. I tied my hair back in a messy ponytail, slipped into a pair of old shoes with worn soles, and looked in the mirror. Gone was the confident executive who walked through glass towers and conference halls. In her place stood a tired woman, one the world might overlook without a second glance. Perfect. I added one last touch, a canvas tote bag, faded at the edges, the kind you pick up at a thrift store. Inside, I carried only my wallet, my keys, and one crisp, black card, my company card. The contrast made me smile. Before leaving, I paused by the door, looking back at my apartment. Every inch of it reflected discipline, restraint, and independence. But that night, none of it mattered. I wasn't walking into that restaurant as Ilara Sterling, Regional Director of Operations. I was walking in as Mom, the modest, quiet woman my son had described to his in-laws. I called a taxi instead of using my car. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, asked where I was headed. Le Vieux Jardin, I said softly. He raised an eyebrow. That's an expensive place? Anniversary? I smiled faintly. Something like that. The drive was long and quiet. Through the window, the city shimmered under the early evening sky, golden light stretching across glass buildings, fading into deep indigo. I watched people rushing along the sidewalks, couples laughing, friends clinking glasses on patios. Somewhere in that blur of life, I felt both invisible and invincible. As we approached the restaurant, I caught my reflection in the window, a woman who looked like she didn't belong in a place like that. And that was exactly the point. When the taxi stopped, the doorman's eyes flickered over me, then away just as quickly. I could feel his silent judgment as he held the door. Inside, the air was cool, perfumed with truffle and aged wine. The low hum of soft jazz mixed with the delicate clatter of silverware. Every detail screamed luxury, the marble floors, the gold-rimmed glasses, the waiters gliding like shadows. I took a deep breath and walked in. Marcus was the first to see me. He stood near a long table by the window, dressed in a sharp navy suit, his posture tense. When his eyes met mine, I saw it, the flicker of shock, followed by the quick attempt to mask it with a smile. "Mom," he said, his voice tight. "You came." "Of course, son," I replied, pretending not to notice the discomfort in his tone. "I wouldn't miss it." Simone turned, and for a split second, her polite smile faltered. Her eyes scanned my outfit, my shoes, my tote bag. It wasn't cruelty, not yet, just the faint disbelief of someone seeing something they didn't expect. "Mother-in-law," she said coolly, brushing her cheek against mine. "It's nice to see you." But her eyes told another story. One that said, "I wish you dressed differently." And then I saw them. Simo's parents, Veronica and Franklin. They sat already poised at the table like royalty on display. Veronica in an emerald green dress that shimmered under the chandelier, her neck heavy with jewels, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked sculpted. Franklin in a perfectly tailored suit, his wrist weighed down by a gold watch that probably cost more than a year's rent. Their eyes met mine. Cold, assessing, clinical. The kind of gaze people use when appraising property, not people. I smiled and walked toward them with small, hesitant steps. The steps of a woman unsure of her place. Marcus's discomfort was almost tangible. He pulled out a chair, not for me, but for Simo's mother. I took the seat at the far end, as if by instinct. No one protested. No one asked if I was comfortable. The waiter appeared with menus printed in French and prices not printed at all. I opened mine and squinted, pretending confusion. Veronica's lips curved into something resembling a smile. "Do you need help with the menu, dear?" "Yes, please," I said softly. "I don't recognize these dishes." She nodded with feigned patience and told the waiter, "She have something simple. Nothing too heavy." Then, turning to me, she added, "We don't want to overdo it, right?" A soft laugh rippled around the table, polite, shallow, condescending. I nodded. "Of course." As the waiter left, conversation resumed, mostly led by Veronica. She spoke about the flight from abroad, the luxury hotel they were staying in, the stores they had visited. Each sentence had a price tag. $1,000 here, 10,000 there. It wasn't conversation. It was performance. I listened quietly, offering small, timid smiles, pretending awe. But inside, I was cataloging every word, every glance, every smug inflection. Years in corporate boardrooms had trained me to read people like open books, and this woman's pages were written in gold ink and insecurity. At one point, Veronica turned to me. "And what do you do, Alara?" "Marcus said you work in an office." "Yes," I replied, lowering my gaze. "Just administrative work, filing, paperwork. Simple things." "Ah," she said, nodding slowly. "Administrative. That's honest work. Nothing wrong with that." "Not everyone is meant for big things," Franklin chuckled. "The world needs all kinds, right?" I smiled. Right. But inside I could feel something cold coil in my chest. The rest of the dinner unfolded like a carefully choreographed play. Veronica spoke of their investments, their houses in 3 countries, their vineyard in Italy. Simone nodded dutifully at all the right moments, though her eyes occasionally flickered toward Marcus, as if silently begging him to fill the awkward silences I left behind. He didn't. He just sat there, tense, ashamed, avoiding my gaze. It was almost poetic. The woman who had once been his hero now sitting at the table as his embarrassment. When the food arrived, Veronica announced proudly, "This steak costs $80. The quality is worth it, don't you think?" I smiled softly. Of course. Quality always is. The irony of that statement was almost too delicious to bear. Through it all, I stayed silent, watching, because sometimes silence is the most powerful response. It lets arrogance echo until it deafens itself, and as the night wore on, I began to realize something deeper. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a test, but not mine. Theirs. They believed they were the ones evaluating me, deciding whether I was worthy of their world. They didn't know I was doing the same to them. And by the end of that dinner, I would know everything I needed to know, about them, about Simone, and even about my own son. I took a sip of water, my reflection rippling faintly in the glass. Let them think I'm poor, I thought. Let them talk, because when the truth comes, and it will come like a storm they never saw coming. And they'll never forget the night they underestimated this simple mother. The morning of the dinner felt like standing at the edge of a stage before the curtain rose. Everything in me was steady, composed, but beneath that stillness ran a quiet current of defiance. I moved through my small apartment deliberately, as if performing a ritual, folding the blanket on the sofa, straightening the picture frames, watering the single plant that had somehow survived my long work hours. I wasn't just preparing to leave. I was grounding myself. In the reflection of my kitchen window, I could see a woman who had fought too many battles to be easily shaken, and yet, that night I was choosing to become someone else. Someone fragile. Someone ordinary. I opened my wardrobe and pulled out the same wrinkled gray dress from the back, the one that carried no elegance, no structure, the kind of dress life gives you when you've stopped expecting beauty. Then came the shoes, scuffed and tired, followed by a faded canvas tote bag. I tied my hair in a careless knot, wiped away every hint of polish, and stood before the mirror. The woman who looked back was unrecognizable. Her shoulders drooped. Her eyes no longer commanded rooms. She looked like someone the world passed without seeing, and that was precisely the disguise I needed. As I dressed, my mind drifted back through the years, to the woman I once was, the one who had walked into an office decades ago with nothing but a pen, determination, and a newborn waiting at home. The one who learned to survive in a world that didn't forgive mistakes. That version of me had built a fortress of discipline and silence. I had learned to wear humility like armor and patience like a crown. But tonight, I was removing that armor piece by piece. Not to become weaker, but to see the truth naked. I wanted to know how people would treat me when they thought I had nothing. Would they still offer me kindness? Or would their eyes glaze over with the invisible cruelty reserved for those who seem beneath them? I wasn't doing this for revenge. It wasn't even about pride. It was curiosity, that cold, piercing kind that lives in people who have spent too long observing the world from behind glass walls. After all, I had seen the powerful pretend to be humble. But I had never seen the humble reveal the powerful by simply existing. When I finally stepped out, the city was draped in twilight, and the air carried that crisp tension before nightfall. The taxi driver glanced at me through the mirror, maybe wondering why someone dressed like me was heading toward one of the most expensive restaurants in town. I didn't explain. Instead, I watched the city blur past, luxury boutiques, shining towers, faces lit by phone screens, each one chasing something they believed would prove their worth. In that quiet ride, I realized how freeing it was to let go of the mask of success. No heels, no silk, no carefully measured words. Just me, stripped of the symbols that made people listen. For the first time in years, I felt anonymous, invisible, and in that invisibility, I found something rare: power. Because when no one expects anything from you, you can see everything. You can listen. You can remember. You can let people expose themselves without ever having to lift a finger. By the time the taxi pulled up in front of the restaurant, my heart was beating slowly, evenly, not with fear, but with purpose. The golden lights from the windows spilled onto the sidewalk, casting long, elegant shadows of strangers who belonged to a world that had never looked my way before. I stepped out, clutching my old tote, and walked toward the entrance. The doorman's polite smile faltered when he saw my outfit, his greeting mechanical. Inside, the scent of wine and candle wax mingled with a low hum of laughter, a language of superiority disguised as sophistication. And as I crossed the threshold, I realized something profound. Tonight, I wasn't pretending to be poor. I was revealing the poverty in others, the poverty of empathy, the poverty of grace. I walked into that restaurant not as a woman seeking approval, but as a mirror, ready to show every soul at that table who they truly were when faced with someone they could not benefit from. And though I looked like the weakest one there, I knew, before the first word was spoken, that I was the most powerful person in the room. The moment I stepped into that restaurant, the world changed texture. It wasn't just the marble floors or the quiet hum of wealth that filled the air. It was the way people looked at me. Not directly, of course. That's never how judgment works. It's in the flicker of eyes that glance and retreat, in the way the waiter's polite smile tightens for just a second longer than usual. I could feel it instantly, the unspoken hierarchy of the room. Everyone there seemed born knowing their place, and they instantly knew mine. Marcus stood up quickly when he saw me, but the relief in his expression was brief, replaced almost immediately by worry. His eyes darted from my worn dress to Simone's parents, as though silently apologizing on my behalf. "Mom," he said softly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You made it." "Of course," I said with a small nod, my voice calm but deliberate. The table stretched out before me like a stage gleaming glassware, crystal lights flickering across the wine bottles. And sitting at the head of that stage was Veronica, her emerald dress shimmering under the chandelier, her lips painted in the color of quiet cruelty. She stood just enough to be polite, her jewelry catching the light as she extended a manicured hand. "A pleasure," she said, in the tone people use when they're trying not to wrinkle their nose. Her husband Franklin followed suit, his handshake brief and perfunctory. Simone's greeting was mechanical, a polite kiss on the cheek that felt as cold as the marble beneath us. I could almost hear the thoughts she was too refined to voice. Why did she come dressed like that? I took my seat, the one farthest from them, of course, and no one thought to move their chairs closer. The waiter handed out menus that might as well have been written in a foreign language. I opened mine and squinted, feigning confusion. Veronica's smile was instantaneous, sharp and glinting. "Do you need help, dear?" she asked, her tone syrupy sweet. "Yes, please," I said softly, as if embarrassed. She turned to the waiter. "Something light and simple." She's not used to rich food. The words landed softly, but their edge was made of steel. Franklin chuckled quietly, and Marcus looked away. I thanked her gently, even smiled. Because I had already decided I wasn't there to fight their arrogance. I was there to let it reveal itself. The conversation began easily enough: travel, hotels, the city's weather, expensive boutiques. Each topic a thinly veiled brag disguised as small talk. Veronica spoke of their suite at $1,000 a night, of Franklin's modest investments, of the vineyard they'd purchased in Italy, just for leisure. Every sentence was a performance, and I was the audience they didn't think mattered. They wanted me to be impressed, and so I was, outwardly. I nodded at every story, murmured how lovely it sounded, how blessed they were. And with every nod, they grew more confident, their words bolder, their arrogance more naked. Then, almost on cue, Veronica tilted her head toward me. "And you, Era?" she asked lightly. "What do you do for work?" I smiled shyly. "I work in an office. Just paperwork, filing, nothing special." She clasped her hands together with exaggerated sympathy. "That's nice. Honest work is valuable. Though of course one always hopes for more." Her voice was sweet but coated in poison. Franklin added, "Yes, yes. But dignity is in any kind of work, isn't it?" They both smiled, like two predators proud of their civility. I smiled back and said softly, "You're right. It's in how we treat people." Veronica blinked, not realizing she'd just been warned. The food arrived, works of art on porcelain plates, each bite a display of refinement. Veronica cut into her steak and commented, almost theatrically, $80 for this, but worth every cent. One can't just eat anything, right? I nodded. Of course. Quality matters. My voice was calm, gentle, but my silence afterward did more than any argument could. They mistook it for ignorance. I knew it was patience. Veronica continued her performance. "We've always been very careful with money," she said, taking a sip of her wine. "Investments, properties. Franklin handles the business side, and I oversee the family's finances. We believe in giving our children everything. Simone studied abroad, learned 4 languages. When she married Marcus, we helped, of course, the down payment, the honeymoon, little things." She laughed softly, her diamonds catching the light. Then she looked at me with full kindness. "And you, Era? Were you able to help Marcus with the wedding? Maybe a small gift?" My fork paused in midair. "A small one," I said quietly. "Something from the heart." "How sweet," she replied, smiling wide enough to show satisfaction, not kindness. Around that table everyone was smiling, but no one was at ease. Not Marcus, not Simone, and certainly not me. Yet, beneath their laughter, I could feel the tension tightening, coiling, waiting. They thought they were winning some invisible game. What they didn't know was that I had stopped playing long ago. As the dinner stretched on, their words became heavier, their condescension more obvious. At one point, Veronica leaned forward, her elbows delicately resting on the table, her tone falsely gentle. "You must be proud of Marcus," she said. "He's done so well, especially considering his background." His background. She meant me, the background he came from. I smiled, a slow, steady smile that made her blink. "Yes," I said softly. "I am proud. He's a good man, kind, honest, and grounded. That's the kind of success money can't buy." Her smile faltered for just a second, then returned. The rest of the table grew quiet, the air heavy with something unspoken. I didn't need to say more. Because what they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that I didn't need to prove anything. My silence was not submission. It was the sound of restraint, the calm before truth unfolds. And as I sat there, quietly finishing my modest meal, I could feel the shift beginning. They had no idea that by the time this dinner ended, their carefully built tower of superiority would crumble in the simplest way imaginable, not by power, not by anger, but by truth. By dessert, the air around that table had thickened, polite laughter still danced across the silverware, but it carried an undertone of discomfort. Even Marcus's smile had grown mechanical, his eyes darting between me and Simone's parents like a man walking a tightrope. The waiter brought creme brulee, its surface crackling under the golden sugar, and for a moment, the conversation fell silent. Then Veronica set down her spoon with a soft clink, folded her hands, and looked at me with the kind of smile that wasn't meant for kindness. It was a prelude to cruelty. "Era," she began, her voice smooth as cream, "there's something Franklin and I have been meaning to discuss with you. Nothing serious, of course, just family matters." Marcus shifted uneasily. Simone's gaze flickered toward him, then down at her plate. My instinct told me whatever came next wasn't going to be pleasant. "You see," Veronica continued, "we've noticed how devoted you are to Marcus. It's admirable, truly. But young couples, they need space, freedom. You understand, don't you?" Her tone was wrapped in honey, but the sting beneath was unmistakable. I simply nodded, my expression unreadable. She exchanged a look with Franklin, who cleared his throat, ready to deliver the next blow. "We mean no disrespect," he said, "but we think it would be best if Marcus and Simone could live their own lives without too much interference or obligation. You've done your part, raised him well, and now it's time to let go." The word obligation hit the air like a cold draft. I could feel my son tense beside me. "We'd like to help you as well," Veronica added quickly, as if softening the insult with what she considered generosity. She opened her purse, elegant fingers pulling out a thin envelope. "Just a little something, a gesture really. To make things easier for you." She slid it across the table toward me, the way one might feed a stray dog. I looked at the envelope, then back at her. "What is this?" I asked, my voice low. "A small token," she replied, her eyes gleaming. "We know life can be difficult on a modest income. Consider it appreciation for all you've done. And perhaps a way to ensure you don't worry too much about Marcus anymore." It took every ounce of composure I had not to laugh. Around the table, time seemed to slow. Simone's eyes widened, Marcus went pale, and Franklin leaned back in satisfaction, as though they had just performed a noble act. My fingers brushed the edge of the envelope. It was thick, heavy, not with kindness but with arrogance. They had mistaken my quiet for need, my humility for weakness. To them, I was a woman whose dignity could be bought, whose silence came at a price. I looked down at the envelope for a long moment, then gently pushed it back toward her. "I appreciate the thought," I said softly, "but I have everything I need." Veronica blinked, confused, perhaps offended. "Please," she said, forcing a laugh, "don't be proud. It's really nothing." Her words clung to the air like perfume gone stale. I looked up at her, really looked at her, and for the first time that night, I saw the desperation beneath her polish. Her confidence wasn't built on character, it was built on control. And right now, she was losing it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Mom, they didn't mean it like that." "I know," I said gently, cutting him off. My tone was calm, almost serene, but inside me something ancient stirred. The part of me that had endured years of condescension, that had built her life brick by brick without anyone's permission. "You meant well," I said to Veronica, my eyes steady. "You see a woman like me and assume she needs help. It's a kind impulse. Misguided but kind." She flushed, her composure cracking for the first time. "I didn't mean." "Of course you did," I said softly, my voice like silk hiding steel. "You meant to remind me of where you think I belong. But here's the thing about people like me, Veronica. We don't need to belong to your world to have worth. We don't measure dignity in dollars." I stood slowly, the chair sliding back with a quiet scrape against the marble floor. "And while I thank you for dinner, I think I've had enough charity for one night." For a moment, no one breathed. The chandelier above flickered. The sound of laughter from another table drifted faintly through the silence, and all eyes were on me. I gave my son a small, knowing smile, not of anger, but of love, then turned toward the waiter. "Would you please bring me the check?" The waiter blinked, uncertain, and looked toward Franklin, who frowned. That won't be necessary, he said, almost mocking. We've got it handled. But I didn't move. No, I said simply. It's my treat. And as the waiter hesitated, I reached into my old canvas bag, pulling out a sleek black card. The kind only a handful of people in this city carried. The kind that needed no introduction. For a brief second the world seemed to freeze. Marcus's eyes widened, Simone's lips parted in shock, and Veronica's color drained completely. The waiter took the card with quiet reverence and walked away. When he returned, his tone had changed. Thank you, Miss Sterling, he said respectfully, handing back the receipt. I signed it with my usual steady hand, tucked the card away, and looked up at the table of stunned faces. Have a lovely evening, I said softly. Then I turned and walked out, calm, composed, and free. Behind me, I could feel their world tilting, their laughter swallowed by the weight of realization. They had offered me money to disappear, but instead, I had given them something they'd never forget, the cost of their own arrogance. When I walked out of that restaurant, the night air felt electric, sharp, cool, alive with something powerful. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the reflections of city lights ripple across the glass windows, and I could almost hear my heart steady itself. Behind me, through the faint hum of conversation, I could still feel their stunned silence, the echo of disbelief that filled the room after I'd signed that bill without blinking. For the first time in years, I didn't need to hide. My truth had already begun to unfold, wordlessly, elegantly. I hadn't raised my voice or declared who I was. I had simply allowed my actions to speak. That was always my way, quiet power, the kind that doesn't need an audience, only a moment. But as I stood there, I realized the night wasn't over yet. Marcus followed me out a few minutes later, his footsteps rushed and uncertain. Mom, he said breathlessly. What? What just happened in there? His voice was a mix of awe and guilt. I turned to him, my expression calm, though my eyes softened at the sight of his confusion. The truth, I said quietly. That's what happened. He stared at me, struggling to find the right words. That card, I didn't know you had that kind of money. I thought. His voice trailed off, shame flickering across his face. You thought I was just an office clerk, I finished for him gently. A simple woman. He nodded slowly, eyes lowered. The vulnerability in his silence hurt more than his assumptions ever had. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air steady me. Marcus, I said softly, when you were little, do you remember when we couldn't afford a heater that one winter? You were 6. I wrapped you in blankets and told you we were camping indoors. He laughed weakly, remembering. I told you that story so you wouldn't be afraid, I continued. And when I started working at the firm, I promised myself that one day you'd never have to worry about anything again. So I worked harder than anyone should have to. I built something real, but I never flaunted it because I wanted you to learn humility before wealth. I wanted you to be strong enough to value character over status. I paused, letting the words settle. I never told you because I wanted you to see people for who they are, not what they have. And tonight, I needed to see the same thing. He nodded slowly, but his face fell, heavy with guilt. I'm so sorry, Mom, he whispered. I was ashamed. Not of you, but of what I thought people would think. Simon's family, their lifestyle, I didn't want them to look down on you. His words came out fractured, sincere, and small. I placed a hand on his cheek, just as I did when he was a boy. And yet they did, I said gently. Because people like that will always find someone to look down on. That's not your shame to carry, it's theirs. He looked up, eyes glistening. You didn't have to do that, though. Pretend to be poor. I smiled faintly. Didn't I? If I hadn't, they would never have shown me who they truly were. They would have smiled to my face and sneered behind my back. But tonight they spoke freely, and in doing so they exposed themselves. Sometimes, Marcus, the best way to know a person is to let them think they're above you. I could see the understanding dawn on him slowly, painfully. The truth had humbled him, not because of my wealth, but because of my restraint. Because he had finally seen that power, when paired with grace, is far greater than arrogance ever will be. As we stood there beneath the golden glow of the restaurant lights, Simone appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide and uncertain. She hesitated, looking between her husband and me. For the first time, there was no arrogance in her face, only confusion and something softer, almost remorseful. "Mrs. Sterling," she said quietly, I didn't know." I turned to her, studying the young woman who had once barely looked at me during dinner. "Now you do," I said simply. She took a hesitant step closer. "My parents. They didn't mean to." "Yes, they did," I interrupted softly but not unkindly. "And that's all right. People reveal their truths when they think no one important is watching. The sad part is, they forget everyone deserves to be treated as important." She lowered her gaze, the reality settling in. There was no anger left in me, only clarity. I had seen enough boardrooms to know that power corrupts quietly, not in grand gestures, but in small acts of disregard. And tonight, I had seen that disregard in full. Still, I wasn't here to humiliate anyone. I wanted them to remember. Not regret, but remember. Because true lessons don't come from punishment. They come from awakening. When I finally walked away from that restaurant, the city felt different. The noise, the lights, the air, all of it seemed to hum with quiet understanding. The truth had been revealed, but not just to them, to me as well. I realized that all those years of silence, of humility, of restraint had not been weakness. They had been preparation. Life had taught me that dignity is not something others can grant or take away. It's something you carry within you, no matter who's sitting across the table. And as I hailed a cab and sank into the back seat, watching the restaurant disappear into the blur of traffic, I felt an unfamiliar peace settle in my chest. I didn't need to explain myself to anyone, not to Marcus, not to Simone, not to the world. The truth had spoken for itself, quietly and irrevocably. And in that silence, I found freedom, not from judgment, but from the need to be understood. Because sometimes, the most powerful revelations don't happen in grand speeches or public apologies. They happen in the quiet moment when those who doubted you finally see who you've been all along. Inside the restaurant, after I had left, the atmosphere shifted like a sudden storm. The confidence that had filled the table only minutes earlier had evaporated, leaving behind a tense silence heavy enough to crush words before they even formed. Veronica sat frozen, her manicured hand still resting on the envelope she'd meant to give me. The envelope that now looked cheap, humiliating, absurd. Franklin cleared his throat and tried to recover his composure, but his face had turned a shade paler. The waiter's respect, once directed toward them, now belonged elsewhere to me. When he'd uttered the words, "Thank you, Miss Sterling," it was like dropping a bomb no one expected. Their name meant nothing here. Mine suddenly did. Marcus sat stiffly, caught between shame and awe, and Simone could barely lift her eyes from her lap. Power has shifted, quietly, brutally, without a raised voice or a single insult. It wasn't wealth that had silenced them. It was the realization that the woman they looked down on was someone their world would normally bow to. Veronica, never one to lose control publicly, forced a brittle laugh. "Well," she said, voice trembling just slightly, "I suppose we've all learned something tonight." Franklin nodded, his jaw tight. Yes, appearances can be deceiving." The words came out like gravel, heavy with humiliation. Simone looked at them both, a flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. "Mom, Dad," she murmured, "please stop." But the damage had already been done. Every person in that restaurant had seen what happened. The subtle humiliation of a proud couple stripped of their illusion of superiority. The whispers had already begun, faint but unmistakable, and Veronica could feel them like needles on her skin. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be looked at with judgment. That single moment, the swiping of my black card, the waiter's reverent tone, had inverted the entire social order she lived by. She wasn't the queen of the room anymore. She was the lesson. Meanwhile, outside, I waited by the curb, the soft hum of the city wrapping around me like distant applause. I wasn't celebrating their discomfort. I was simply watching balance return to the world. For years, I had sat in meetings where men like Franklin underestimated me until I signed contracts worth their annual profits. I had smiled through their dismissive laughter, knowing that the most devastating truths need no announcement. Tonight had been no different. But as the restaurant door opened and Marcus and Simone stepped out, I saw in their faces something I hadn't expected. Humility, yes, but also a strange kind of relief. "They're shaken," Marcus said quietly, almost apologetically. I nodded. "Good. Sometimes a mirror is necessary." Simone hesitated beside him, her voice low. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to," I replied softly. "Just remember this night. Remember how quickly respect can vanish when people judge by appearances." She nodded, her eyes glassy with something like guilt, or maybe awakening. I could tell she was beginning to understand the quiet strength she'd mistaken for weakness. Later that evening, back at my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, the city glowing beneath me like a sea of untold stories. I thought about how easily the world divides people, rich and poor, powerful and powerless, worthy and unworthy, and how fragile those divisions really are. A single act, a single truth, can turn everything upside down. I hadn't set out to embarrass anyone. I had only wanted them to see me, to see the kind of woman who doesn't wear her worth like jewelry but carries it like a heartbeat. Somewhere deep inside, I hoped Veronica and Franklin would reflect on that. Maybe in time they would understand that wealth without respect is just decoration. And as for my son, I knew he would never look at me the same way again. Not with pity, but with pride. The tables had turned, yes, but more importantly, they had balanced. For the first time in years, the world felt even, and as I watched the night unfold below me, a quiet smile found its way to my lips. Justice, I realized, doesn't always come with fury. Sometimes it arrives dressed in silence, holding nothing but truth. The next morning arrived quietly, like the world was holding its breath. Sunlight filtered through my window, spilling across the room in soft gold, touching the corners of my life that had once felt heavy, but now felt weightless. I sat at my small dining table with a cup of coffee and thought about everything that had unfolded the night before. It wasn't victory that warmed me, it was peace. For years, I lived with the quiet ache of being misunderstood, of being seen as less than simply because I chose humility over display. But last night, that mask had fallen. I hadn't planned to reveal who I was. I'd only wanted to see the truth in others. Yet somehow, the truth had done what it always does when given room to breathe. It brought clarity. And clarity, I realized, is a far greater teacher than revenge. I didn't need to lecture anyone. The silence I left behind had already spoken for me. The restaurant, the glances, the shock, all of it was a reflection, not of my power, but of their blindness. By mid-morning, Marcus called. His voice was soft, careful, almost childlike. "Mom," he said, "can I come over?" When he arrived, he stood in the doorway longer than usual, as if unsure how to enter. The man who had once carried quiet embarrassment when introducing me now stood with a new kind of reverence. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, taking a seat across from me. I smiled. "Start anywhere." He rubbed the back of his neck, searching for words. "I feel ashamed. I let people, even Simone, think less of you. I never corrected them. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really protecting my own pride." I reached across the table and took his hand, my voice calm but firm. "Marcus, protecting someone's image at the cost of truth is never kindness. You don't owe the world perfection. You owe it honesty. And if others can't handle that honesty, that's their burden, not yours." He nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "You're right," he whispered. I should have been proud of the woman who raised me, who built everything from nothing. I see that now. I squeezed his hand gently. You don't need to say more. Just live differently from now on. That's how you honor me, not with apologies, but with awareness. A few days later, Simone called. Her voice trembled through the phone. Mrs. Sterling, she began. I wanted to apologize. My parents, they were wrong. I was wrong too. There was sincerity there, a fragile, unfamiliar humility. You don't owe me an apology, I said gently. You just needed to see things clearly. Now that you do, you'll never unsee them. She was quiet for a moment, then confessed, growing up, I thought respect was something you earn through wealth, through status. But after that night, I realized respect has nothing to do with money. It's how you treat people who have nothing to offer you. I smiled softly into the receiver. That's a lesson worth keeping, I said. And it's one most people spend a lifetime learning. She exhaled, almost like she'd been holding her breath for days. Thank you, she whispered, for handling it with grace. I don't think I would have. I laughed quietly. Grace isn't weakness, Simone. It's restraint. It's knowing you could destroy someone's illusion but choosing to let them discover it, themselves. That silence on the line, the one filled with quiet reflection, told me she understood. Maybe for the first time in her life. In the weeks that followed, something shifted between all of us. Veronica and Franklin, though too proud to call, sent a letter, brief, awkward, but meaningful. They apologized in their way for the misunderstanding. I didn't mean more than that. I wasn't seeking repentance. I only wanted recognition, not for my wealth, but for my humanity. Marcus visited more often, no longer out of obligation, but with genuine affection. He brought Simone, who helped in the kitchen and laughed easily, her sharp edges softened. Life felt lighter, freer, not because anyone had changed dramatically, but because the truth had reset the balance. Respect had found its rightful place. And one evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights blink like stars falling too low, I realized something profound. Life will always test your dignity, sometimes through cruelty, sometimes through misunderstanding. But dignity isn't about how loudly you demand respect. It's about how calmly you hold your worth when others fail to see it. That night, I lifted my glass of wine to the skyline and smiled. Because the greatest lesson I'd ever taught wasn't to my son or to his in-laws, it was to myself. That respect isn't given or taken. It's lived. Time has a strange way of stretching after moments that change everything. In the days following that dinner, the world seemed to move slower, as if it too was digesting what had happened. The shock had worn off, but the echoes remained faint, persistent, shaping everything they touched. Marcus seemed lighter now, as though shedding the burden of appearances had given him room to breathe. We spent more time together, quiet dinners, long talks, laughter that no longer felt strained. He spoke about work, about plans for the future, about how he wanted to build something of his own, not to impress anyone, but to feel proud of his own efforts. I could hear sincerity in his voice that hadn't been there before. It reminded me of the little boy who used to dream out loud, before the world taught him that dreams had to be dressed in luxury to be respected. Watching him rediscover that part of himself filled me with a quiet pride. For years, I had wondered if I failed him by hiding my success. But now I saw the truth. He had needed to lose the illusion of status to see the value of integrity. Simone, too, began to change, subtly at first, then with visible intention. The young woman who once carried her wealth like armor started showing up in jeans instead of designer dresses when she visited. She laughed more, listened more, and stopped trying to fill silences with stories about expensive trips or lavish plans. One afternoon, she joined me in the garden, her manicured hands awkwardly pressing seeds into soil. I've never done this before, she admitted with a soft laugh. It feels grounding. I smiled. That's what humility does. It brings you back to the earth. She looked at me then, really looked at me. her eyes filled with something between admiration and apology. I used to think people who lived simply were missing out, she said quietly. Now I think they're the only ones who really live. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The way she said it told me she finally understood the lesson that night had whispered to her. That worth isn't built from what you own, but from what you give, how you listen, how you respect, how you love. And that realization, once found, ripples outward. Even Veronica and Franklin couldn't escape those ripples. Word of the restaurant scene had spread through their circle faster than fine wine at a dinner party. Some whispered about it with pity, others with awe, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that it forced them to look in the mirror. A few weeks later, they invited me to tea. The gesture was stiff but sincere. I went, not out of obligation, but curiosity. Their home was just as grand as expected, yet somehow emptier than I remembered. Veronica greeted me with a smile that didn't hide behind perfection this time. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice quieter than usual. We sat in her sunlit conservatory, and for the first time there was no competition, no pretense, just two women, stripped of titles, sitting face to face. "You were right," she said finally, her eyes glistening. "We treated you terribly. I was raised to believe appearances meant everything. I suppose it's hard to unlearn that," I nodded gently. "Unlearning is still learning," I said. "And it's never too late for either." She exhaled, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the tea. Franklin, usually so proud and composed, was quiet throughout. His silence, I think, was the truest apology of all. When I left that afternoon, the world between us felt repaired, not perfect, not friendly, but human. The changes didn't end there. The truth had rippled far beyond our families. Simon's parents began supporting local charities, not for prestige, but quietly, anonymously. Marcus started mentoring younger colleagues at work, teaching them lessons about integrity I'd once taught him at our old kitchen table. And as for me, I found myself walking through life a little lighter, my secret no longer a burden but a reminder that truth, when revealed at the right time, doesn't destroy. It heals. One evening, I stood by my window again, the same skyline stretching endlessly before me. The city lights blinked like distant stars, and I thought about how fragile and beautiful human transformation is. You can't force it. You can only live your truth so clearly that others can't help but see their own reflection in it. That night, I whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, not for the wealth I'd earned, but for the lessons I'd lived. Because money can change circumstances, but only truth can change people. And if that night in the restaurant had been the storm, then these ripples, gentle, lasting, unstoppable, were the calm that followed. It's strange how peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't announce itself with applause or clarity, it just slips in one morning, as soft as sunlight through curtains. That's how it came for me. Weeks had passed since the dinner that changed everything, and the world had found its rhythm again. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The distance that once lived between me and my son had vanished, replaced by warmth that felt effortless, real. When he visited now, he didn't look at me through the lens of pity or pride. He simply saw me, and that was enough. We'd sit together on Sunday mornings, sipping coffee on the balcony, talking about everything and nothing, work, memories, plans. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. We just sit in companionable silence, watching the world move below us. I used to think love was measured in grand gestures, the sacrifices, the giving. But now I knew the truth. Real love lives in those quiet, ordinary moments when you no longer need to prove anything. Simone has softened too. One afternoon she came over alone, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. "It's nothing fancy," she said shyly. Inside was a simple charm bracelet, silver and unpolished. "I made it," she admitted, laughing nervously. "I thought of you when I saw the charms, a heart for kindness, a key for wisdom, and a feather for grace." I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of what it represented, not luxury, not guilt, but genuine affection. "It's perfect," I said. She smiled, relief washing over her. We talked for hours that day, not about money or family expectations, but about life, her fears, her hopes, her struggle to find identity beyond her parents' shadow. I listened, as I always had, but this time she listened too. That's the quiet miracle of humility. It builds bridges where pride once built walls. As she left that evening, she hugged me tighter than she ever had before. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing me what strength really looks like." I smiled. "You'll show it yourself one day, just remember to do it softly." That night, as I sat alone in my living room, I thought about how far we'd all come. Not just in circumstance, but in spirit. Respect, I realized, isn't something that's taught. It's something that's caught, absorbed through example. You can't demand it. You have to live it. The people who once looked down on me had learned that lesson in the most humbling way possible, not through confrontation, but through contrast. And maybe that's what the world needs more of, not louder voices, but steadier ones. The kind that don't argue for recognition, but demonstrate worth through quiet consistency. My life had never been loud, and I was proud of that. In the silence of my choices, I have found something stronger than validation. I have found peace. And maybe that was the richest thing I would ever own. As the city outside dimmed into night, I stepped onto the balcony, the wind brushing against my face like an old friend. Below, the streets glimmered, alive, endless, full of stories I'd never know. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting go of every expectation, every mask, every misunderstanding that had ever weighed me down. In that moment, I realized that freedom doesn't always come from walking away. Sometimes, it comes from standing still, from being exactly who you are without needing anyone to see it. I had spent a lifetime mastering silence, but now, for the first time, it didn't feel like restraint. It felt like release. The world no longer owed me understanding, and I no longer owed it explanation. I smiled to myself, a soft, content smile, and whispered into the night, "Sometimes, the greatest power is the peace that follows the truth." And with that, I closed the door, turned off the lights, and let the quiet embrace me, at last truly free.